What's up, everybody? We are live with the Awesemo Waiver Wire Show, the Week 11 edition. I am your host, Matt Gajewski, here with my partner in crime, Kyle Dvorchak. You can follow him on Twitter at Kyle Tweets Here, and you can follow me at Matt_Gajewski. Today's show is sponsored by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, the most trusted name in fantasy sports. Yahoo DFS now includes CSV uploads and CSV edit features for those looking to play multiple lineups. Make better choices, choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. And before we get started, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you know when this and all other content at Awesemo goes live. Kyle, what is up, my friend? It was probably the least, injury-filled week that I can remember recently. There were a couple injuries. I know Christian McCaffrey, we got news on him that he's probably not going to return this week, and his backup, Mike Davis, got banged up. Otherwise, I think it was really just Drew Brees and Bridgewater, both of which don't seem to be too significant. How did week 10 turn out for you, my friend?
Yeah, it wasn't the best DFS week. It turns out Mike Davis is not a direct replacement for Christian McCaffrey in every sense of it, but I don't feel too bad. He was fine, I guess. He also got dinged up in that game and came back in but didn't do much. He had a goal line carry that if he had scored, maybe we're not here being so disappointed in him. But it was, like you said, it was both largely low scoring, the early slate, which was shorter than usual, but the early slate was very quiet, and the late slate wasn't, incredibly explosive either, and not a ton of injuries at all. Like you said, we had some quarterback injuries. They don't seem long-term. No real, we don't have a Mike Davis this week. We don't have Wayne Gallman, who's been surprisingly decent in lieu of all of the other Giants backs. No one-for-one replacements, and the ones that are even 1.5 for one or half for one, they're 1 or 2 week rentals. So it's a lot of picking and choosing your spots this week.
Yeah, I think this could be a week where maybe if you are already a playoff team, you take your sights towards the playoffs and maybe you try to scoop some guys long-term that might be in positive matchups or someone that you think could grow into a larger role down the stretch for your playoff run. Obviously, if you are looking for wins right now, this week is going to be a little bit difficult, but that's what we are here for, breaking down the waiver wire ahead of this upcoming week 11 slate. Now, just for the purposes of bookkeeping, we are going to talk about a lot of players today. We use a 50% owned threshold. So players have to be available in more than 50% of standard leagues for us to talk about them. There will be a few guys we mentioned here and there, just off the cuff. If they're in your league, make sure you grab them. But otherwise, that is the threshold we use. And we go position by position. We will start this off with QB. And this was really the only position that had some decent injuries. Significant injuries is probably what I should say. Drew Brees, Teddy Bridgewater. Drew Brees looks like he could miss maybe this week. It's a rib injury with him, but still nothing long-term. Teddy Bridgewater, it was a knee injury to the opposite knee that he had previously injured, and there was no structural damage. So it looks like it could just be a short absence for Teddy Bridgewater, if an absence at all. So that leaves us with, the waiver wire here. We don't have a ton of available starters again. I think looking to the potential guys here, Tua Tagovailoa, Derek Carr stand out a little bit. And Teddy Bridgewater is available in more than 50% of leagues as well. I think if he's healthy, he's someone I could look to. What are you really making of the waiver wire situation this week at quarterback?
Yeah, it's particularly thin because a lot of the decent streaming quarterbacks are on bye. I guess Teddy Bridgewater is a guy who we just continue to hammer on, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like we'll get him this week. And if we do, also, I would just be concerned about his health. I know they said the injury doesn't appear to be too serious, but that could just be the case that, it's not serious. They keep him out a week or two or whatever. And even if he does play, I'd be concerned about his health. And right now, the state of his offense with, onto their fourth and fifth string running back, a hobbled Teddy Bridgewater, not great. So, he was a guy we always look to. Daniel Jones is a guy we look to a lot. He's on bye this week, I believe. Even Nick Foles passes a lot. So we're looking at potentially some maybe more suspect spots. Jameis Winston, though, is maybe my favorite one to talk about. I don't know if he's the best, but Jameis Winston versus Atlanta. This is a matchup we saw last year and probably the years before that too, where you would just hammer Jameis Winston. I think the biggest question is, does Jameis Winston play like we expect old Jameis Winston to? My lean is that not so much. I do think that we see, we saw it with, Tom Brady, where he goes from one of the most conservative passing attacks in New England and didn't have the weapons to be aggressive to this Tampa Bay offense, and he plays lights out and aggressive and fun. I think the opposite kind of thing happens where Jameis Winston was in that offense. Now he goes to a less exciting offense. I still think he keeps some of that aggressiveness, but I do think if anything, Sean Payton probably does reel him in a bit. So versus Atlanta, it's a great matchup. He's got good weapons. I'd be looking to target Jameis Winston, but maybe not over the likes of especially someone who I think has, in the same ballpark of weekly upside, like a Tua Tagovailoa, but I know I can keep Tua this week and potentially get more starts out of him in the long term, maybe even the fantasy playoffs. So someone like Tua, maybe versus this week, if you just need a 1 week starter, you could argue Jameis over him. But I think the long-term upside of a Tua obviously dwarfs Jameis Winston.
Yeah, so speaking of Tua Tagovailoa, he is the quarterback we have ranked number 1 on our waiver list. If you were looking for a spot starter at quarterback, he is only owned in 45% of leagues right now, and he's taking on Denver this week. But like you mentioned, I wouldn't be too concerned with the 1 week matchup for Denver. Not that it's a scary one, but with Tua, you have that long-term upside of someone you could potentially use down the stretch in your playoff run, which is why I am particularly interested in him. Not to mention this Miami team has, I think, looked very sharp throughout the course of the season. And when we look to the playoffs, they have some pretty nice matchups, especially if you're assuming your playoffs start week 14, you draw Kansas City right away. That is a potential shootout. Week 2, you've got New England, whose secondary has regressed significantly. Coming into last week, they were allowing the second most yards per attempt. And then that championship week, you're taking on Vegas. So Tua has a phenomenal stretch of schedules in the fantasy playoffs, something I would potentially be looking at if you're dealing with a quarterback with a tougher slate of opponents. Someone else we're thinking about looking at this week specifically is Derek Carr. You and I both have him ranked number 2. And Derek Carr has quietly played pretty efficient football this year. He's in the top 10 in completion percentage and yards per attempt. And Derek Carr gets the Chiefs this week. So while we expect the Vegas Raiders to be trailing, it should lead to ample passing opportunities for Carr. What are we making of Derek Carr against the Chiefs?
Yeah, I believe it has been like 3 consecutive games, maybe under 200 yards for Derek Carr. But I know at least in the past 2 games, their running attack has just been one of those is probably the weather game versus Cleveland, and most recently versus Denver, where they scored 4 rushing touchdowns. It was Devontae Booker revenge game and Josh Jacobs tops 100 yards. I think in the games where their defense, which is probably perfectly average, I don't think it's as terrible as it used to be. It's probably not great, but when their defense can stop a bad quarterback like Drew Lock, or when they play in a terrible weather game where they don't want to be passing, sure, you're going to get dud games from Derek Carr, but he's an efficient passer. And when they actually have to put up points on the board, they can't stop their opponent from putting up points. They're not going to be able to run the ball 25 to 30 times in a game. This does project to be one of those games versus Kansas City. So for that reason, you combine an increase in pass volume with Derek Carr's already pretty solid efficiency. I think you get a good streamable outing from him. My only concern would be that I just don't think he compares to the long-term upside of a Tua. But that's the same argument with Jameis Winston, and that's the reason we have Tua as 1 and Derek Carr and Jameis 2 and 3. They're both good spot starters. I just think the long-term upside of Tua is better, although the matchup this week for Carr should at least be exciting in terms of the overall points scored.
For sure. Man, I'm excited for that Las Vegas Miami game that's going to show down in week 16 in the fantasy playoffs. If I make it there, I'm probably going to be taking a look at Tua in some of my leagues. Now, to get to Jameis, who we do have number 3, I think you laid this out nicely. So I'm going to lay out the concerns with Jameis.
Sure.
As far as this week, well, essentially he's a 1 week rental because we're not expecting Brees to miss much time if he misses this week at all. If he plays, again, this is Jameis, presuming he's the starter, I think he will split some time with Taysom Hill. We saw Taysom Hill on the field quite a bit last week, mainly in run packages. So take this for what it's worth. I do believe Jameis is the one who's passing in this offense, but I still think anytime your quarterback comes off the field, even a little bit, you can bump them down. Still, the matchup against Atlanta is about as good as they come. So when you get an aggressive quarterback like Jameis, even for a 1 week rental, if you're just looking for a streamer this week, he'd be the player I prefer. It sounds like you're on him too. Outside of this, we start looking at some other signal callers that I don't quite like as much. I mean, if you're looking for a really deep player, Kirk Cousins, maybe you could consider against a bad Dallas defense, but we know how Minnesota is trying to play. You could potentially look to Phillip Rivers against Green Bay. They've been up and down on defense this year, but again, we generally know how Indianapolis likes to play. Both of those teams approach the run. Are you looking at anyone else behind Winston?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I hope one of these, I mean, Jameis Winston is available in almost every league. There's no leagues that are holding back for quarterbacks, but say you get nabbed, like say you want to put in a bid for someone else or put in, your waiver wire selection for someone else. I would think, oh man, this is a tough week. I would think maybe you could look to a guy like Kirk Cousins who gets a great matchup against a terrible Dallas defense. Although on the flip side of that, the running attack also gets a great matchup. So you're really flipping a coin if Kirk Cousins gets one of the first 2 or 3 passing or the first 2 or 3 overall touchdowns. That's great. You've got a good Kirk Cousins week, and there is a decent chance that he does that. However, if he doesn't score on their first 2 or 3 drives and they're all Dalvin Cook scores, you're probably drawing dead, getting 5 or 6 pass attempts in the second half. So I think his upside is really good because the matchup it doesn't hardly come any better. But the downside is that if he doesn't end up getting one of the first few scores, they could just take the air out of the ball and not pass it all in the second half. So I love his upside. And because of that, I think his upside is as much, if not more, than a Drew Lock and a Phillip Rivers. And his floor is probably the same. Like Drew Lock's floor is that he's just downright bad. We saw that last week, whereas at least Kirk Cousins is decent and gets a good upside. So he would be probably the last guy I would look to outside of our top three right now. It is not a good week, though.
Yeah, to sum up the quarterback position before we move on, we have Tua Tagovailoa ranked number 1 for his long-term upside. We talked about the playoff schedule, which is favorable for him. Number 2 is Derek Carr. Similar reasons, and you laid out very well how Derek Carr may have underproduced given the expectations this week, but there's strong reasons for that, meaning the wind and a few other factors. And number 3 is more of a specific add to this week. It would be Jameis Winston. But before we move on, guys, I want to tell you about some Awesemo Plus tools that you can get access to for nearly every sport out there with an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. This includes full access to all the premium content and tools on Awesemo.com, including player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, and much more. If you're only looking to play NFL, then you can sign up for our weekly NFL package for $14.95 or give our NFL Weekly Express Pass a shot for $3.95. Stop guessing, start winning, join Awesemo Plus today. Heading over to the running back position. This is generally the marquee position on the waiver wire. It is heavily influenced by injuries. And this week, seemingly for the first time all year, it was not a very heavy injury week. Really, we only had Mike Davis. There's a couple other players who are dealing with existing injuries, Joe Mixon and Chris Carson. We'll learn more about their status throughout the week. Most of their backups are already owned. So as it pertains to this week, a lot of the backs we're going to look at are in timeshares and things of that nature. There's not a lot of backs in emerging roles. One situation I want to hit on right away is this Carolina situation. So latest we have is that Christian McCaffrey is not expected to play this week. Again, this is all tentative. We'll know more later in the week. And Mike Davis injures his thumb. Questionable with him going forward. Is there anyone you would really consider adding off the waiver wire in this backfield?
Yeah, I think it all depends on the status of Mike Davis. I mean, he injured his thumb and came back in with either a very big wrap or like the full club on. I guess the full club is actually probably a cast, so maybe they didn't put that on. But yeah, he did not look like he was in any shape to be playing. And the broadcasters made sure to point that out. They were like, this is brutal, the fact that he's still in here. So it wouldn't shock me if he didn't play this week. It kind of all depends, though. If he does play, I don't even think you'd be looking to start him because I would imagine he does get subbed out a decent amount with that injury, especially with respect to his ability to catch passes, which is kind of the reason we like him. So if that's the case, I'd argue maybe it's just a more exciting reason to put Curtis Samuel in the flex. Outside of that, if Mike Davis is ruled out, potentially a Trenton Cannon. I know Reggie Bonifant, I think, got pulled back onto the roster in recent weeks, but he was a practice squad player heading into the season. So not too interested in a ton of these backups, I think simply because of the ambiguity. If we really just don't know what's going to happen if Mike Davis is out, and if he's in, it's just kind of a mess.
And that's exactly it. We don't have any of these backs ranked in our top 5. I just wanted to bring up this situation because there's a lot of McCaffrey owners out here that may be looking to this backfield. If we just look at what they did last week when Mike Davis was out, they played Rodney Smith for 9 snaps. Rodney Smith is an undrafted free agent out of Minnesota. He profiles more as your grinder back. And then they played Trenton Cannon for 6 snaps, who profiles more as your pass catching back. And of course, they elevated Reggie Bonifant, and I think he would probably be active in coming weeks too. But again, probably not a situation you're looking to. They might use Curtis Samuel some more in that role. So let's talk about some runners we are actually interested in picking up this week. There are some decent runners on the waiver wire, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but our number 1 is Kalen Ballage, only owned in 19% of leagues. But hey, man, he is playing for an explosive Chargers offense. I think he's actually a solid waiver wire add and probably my number 1 overall claim this week.
Yeah, I think there's maybe the only other argument would be like Salvin Ahmed. Is that roughly how you say it, right?
You said it exactly right. Salvin Ahmed.
Yeah. Okay. So he basically profiles as a similar back in terms of getting Ahmed saw, I think, upwards of 20 carries last week. The only problem is I do think his offense, although good, I would still want to target the Chargers offense. And we're not sure what we're going to see from Matt Breida and potentially Myles Gaskin's coming back. I believe he's got one more week where he's locked down to IR. Then he could come back. Austin Eckler also posted a workout video of him potentially coming back, but we do have, I believe, Justin Jackson on IR. I think overall, these guys are so similar in the role they will see with their starting running backs out. I just have a slight bit of more confidence that Austin Eckler and Justin Jackson will be out longer than the combination of Matt Breida and Myles Gaskin. So I'm looking at similar roles and just trying to pick out who can I squeeze out one more week out of. And to me, it definitely seems like that guy would be Ballage. And he plays in an offense I give a modest lean to because they run a lot and they play fast and they score a ton of points. So Ballage and Ahmed are so similar. I do think, though, that Ballage could give you one more week of starting value, and that's really the difference maker, because not only, like, it sounds like one more week, but it could end up being double the starting amount of weeks because we could just be looking at 1 week rentals for both of these guys.
I'm with you 100%. I give the slight lean to Kalen Ballage here. Like you mentioned, though, Salvon Ahmed is a strong add as well. I don't know what it is with this Miami Dolphins team. They have the pipeline to Washington, the Washington Huskies, that is. Both Myles Gaskin and Salvon Ahmed were the starting running back at Washington in back-to-back years. Both come to this Dolphins team as UDFAs. Now, Salvon Ahmed, Jordan Howard was basically he was inactive as a healthy scratch, and then they didn't really use DeAndre Washington. They didn't use Patrick Laird. It was a lot of the Salvon Ahmed show. You laid out the concerns. Matt Breida could play this week. What does this offense look like if Breida comes back? I do think, for what it's worth, that Ahmed has earned at least some share of this backfield when Gaskin and Breida are healthy. He played very well in their absence, but like you mentioned, I just think those players will come back sooner than we could see some of the Chargers backs. Looking behind them, the next two runners we have on our waiver wire list are two Colts backs. Disappointing for the Jonathan Taylor owners, but positive for people that need running back help. Jordan Wilkins is only owned in 18% of leagues. Nyheim Hines is only owned in 41% of leagues. How are we breaking down these two backs in Indianapolis?
Yeah, I think they're so close because they're kind of opposite sides of the coin, where do you want to lock down 12 carries and a target or two? Then go for Jordan Wilkins. If you want to lock down 5 targets and maybe only like 2 or 3 carries, go for Hines. I think both are perfectly viable. We have Jordan Wilkins as our number 3. Maybe I'd be going with Hines. I don't know. Maybe it's just because he's been spiky at scoring touchdowns, which is largely unrepeatable. Or maybe there's just something to me liking these like PPR scat backs more, but I do think they're essentially the same fantasy player. They just get there in different ways. And all this comes on the back of Jonathan Taylor just simply doing nothing. And I'm like, honestly, it's sad, but I'm not that concerned that Jordan Wilkins gives up a ton of work to Taylor going forward, because it just seems like that has not been the plan at almost at any point this season. Wilkins has played well enough to hold on to his 1A running back role. I think both of them have capped upsides, which is why they fall far. Like, it's a tier break. It is Ahmed, Ballage, and then a big gap to number 3 because you're looking at committee backs who can just fill in for a single week. Any preference to you between Hines and Wilkins? I think they're similar in how they project. They just get there in different ways.
I had a slight lean towards Wilkins because his volume has been a little bit better, and we're splitting hairs here. I think Nyheim Hines has run a little bit hot with touchdowns, and that I think is also why he's owned in 41% of leagues. There'll be a lot of leagues where Hines isn't owned, where you just flat out probably are looking at Wilkins instead because he's only owned in 18% of leagues. So that's how I would break it down. I think Hines has run a little hot on touchdowns, but ultimately I think both are fine backs. They both play in an offense that's conducive to running back scoring. Phillip Rivers is throwing it to the running back position, just like he always does, league high rates, which we love for fantasy football. After this, I think there's probably another tier break. Once we get down past the Colts backs, we have Rex Burkhead as our next most attractive add on the waiver wire. He is only owned in 24% of leagues, but similar to the similar to the Colts situation, Rex Burkhead, he's in a 3-way timeshare in most weeks, unless there's some sort of injury situation. Now, the reason I think there's a tier break here is just the difference in the overall offenses. New England has struggled for large stretches of the season, whereas Indianapolis has been able to score pretty easily. So Rex Burkhead for me comes in at 5, and I think he's pretty clearly down there below the Colts backs. What do you make of Burkhead?
Yeah, I think I like him a little more than you. Not to the point where
he catches touchdowns from Jacoby Myers.
I know he's the I think he actually is like a perfect parallel to Hines, specifically because we've seen James White kind of filtered to the back of the receiving role. Most recently, I believe he had 2 targets to Burkhead's 4 or 5. Although that is why I do believe Hines is the better asset of these two guys, because they play similar roles. A few carries, mostly based on targets. Fluky touchdown efficiency has kind of been why we actually know who they are this season. Although there is one team, the New England Patriots, who have 2 pass-catching potential backs, and it seems like at this point the Colts only have 1 in Hines. Does Burkhead seem to be running ahead of James White? Sure. But could that disappear within the next week or two? Absolutely. We could see White filtered back into the lineup, like Burkhead gets a target or 2 and only 4 or 5 carries. So I think they're both just like fine PPR backs. Are sort of like Chase Edmonds from early in the season, except they don't have that immediate upside of when one starter goes down, they get the bulk of the work. So because of that, they're low upside, modest floor guys that can get you through in a pinch. If you had some running back injuries, say, you had Christian McCaffrey and you picked up Mike Davis, both those guys are out, you could potentially look to a Burkhead, and I'd probably look to a Burkhead or a Hines over any of the backups in Carolina.
Yeah, and as we get a little deeper on the waiver wire, there aren't a lot of attractive names as far as just spot starters you could potentially look to. I think some long-term assets you could maybe take a look at. Someone that's playing tonight is Ryan Nall. He is 6% owned, and I'm not very excited about the Bears backfield. That's why they're not in the top 5. But there is some ambiguity with that situation, just not knowing if it's going to be, Lamar Miller, Ryan Nall. I know Artavis Pierce is an undrafted free agent they have on that Bears roster. There's a chance Ryan Nall handles 20 carries. The injury isn't expected to be long-term with David Montgomery, but again, head injuries are a little hard to gauge, so there's a little bit of upside there. Tevin Coleman is someone I think we could maybe look to. JaMychal Hasty broke his collarbone. We saw Jerick McKinnon handle probably more work than Kyle Shanahan wants to give him. Coleman appears to be getting closer. He wasn't placed on injured reserve when he initially had the injury. So maybe if you're looking for a flyer, I know they will return Raheem Mostert at some point too. So I don't think there's as much long-term upside with Coleman as some of the other backs we've mentioned. Anyone stick out to you as a real deep flyer?
Yeah, like not super deep because we all know his name from one like chalk bust DFS week. But Alexander Madison owned in about a third of leagues. I think this is exactly what we talked about early in the show, where if you are in desperate need of running back production, I don't think Madison's your guy. I think you probably project median for more points out of all the top 5 that we just talked about. But do you get potentially more long-term upside by getting I don't know, unfortunately, but if you got a Dalvin Cook injury, would Alexander Madison probably be an RB1 for the final stretch of, 3, 4, 5 games? Absolutely. So if you can afford to just hold a guy on your bench, and this is a week where that might be what you're looking to do, there's not a ton of great pickups. Alexander Madison would clearly be the guy. I think you could argue that for a Cam Akers, because we finally saw him lead the team in carries once again. But this is now 3 consecutive weeks that we've had Cam Akers, I believe Malcolm Brown last week potentially, and Darrell Henderson the week before that. Different leading running backs in 3 consecutive weeks. They have no clue what they're doing with this backfield, or maybe they do, and they're choosing to do it this way. But because of that, I think Akers kind of falls into that rookie hype, good prospect upside guy. But he doesn't seem like he has a 3-down role at any point this season.
I'm with you on Akers. To sum up our running back position, we have number 1, Kalen Ballage, number 2, Salvin Ahmed. Then there's a tier break. Number 3 and 4 are the 2 Colts backs. I personally have a slight lean towards Wilkins at 3 over Nyheim Hines, but I do not feel strongly about it. Hines is far more owned, so a lot of you probably don't even have to make this decision. Yeah. Then at number 5, we have Burkhead, followed by some of the flyers we mentioned. Before we move on to wide receivers, I want to tell you about one of the coolest tools we have at Awesemo.com. It is the Odd Shopper tool. And if you are a bettor, I think this is absolutely key. This tool allows you to search lines, totals, player props, everything you could imagine from the various sports books. It allows you to find the best price, which has a significant effect on your long-term return on these bets. Also, you can track your bets. You can set alerts when these hit a certain price. And best of all, this tool is free. You can find it on oddshopper.awesemo.com. Make sure you check it out if you're into sports betting. Wide receiver, there wasn't a lot as far as injuries. Basically, the only injury of note I had that is very significant moving forward was John Brown, and we don't know his status. I know when he got hurt, he didn't leave the sideline. He was out there trying to loosen it up, trying to warm up and get back out there. John Brown's been hurt many times this year, so we kind of know who is going to fill in and what roles they're going to play if there's a positive to the situation at all. Still, I think there is a wide receiver 1 on the waiver wire. It's not the most attractive fantasy situation, and it is with the New England Patriots. I want you to tell me about Jacoby Myers, Kyle.
Yeah, so I was kind of surprised. I thought early in the season we were seeing a surprising amount of Damiere Byrd. So when we started losing your Julian Edelmans, losing your N'Keal Harris, I thought, well, Byrd would be the guy who would step up. And up until last night, I know he was actually leading the team in routes run by a pretty significant margin. He was their receiver who was out there on every single snap. He just doesn't draw any targets. Jacoby Myers is the actual number 1 receiver for New England. And like you said, it maybe is not the most attractive team to target in terms of your receiving work, but the volume has been so good for Myers that I don't think it entirely matters that his market share numbers are so high that it makes up for having a relatively small pie to work with. And we've seen, I think, Newton kind of filter back to being maybe league average as a passer, which is good enough. I think it is not an offense that the passing attack is so bereft of talent that you can't target anyone. arguably like we've seen, like, I don't know, like the Jets at some points, especially like last year. So I think it's a good enough offense and a player is seeing enough work that someone like Jacoby Myers, who's still available in just over half of leagues, should be the priority add. And we saw last night, I don't think N'Keal Harry played a single snap. I know he wasn't targeted, and I was just pulling up his Pro Football Reference page. They didn't have him logging any snaps. So maybe it's still because he's coming back from the concussion, I believe. But at this point, his production has been so dismal that Damiere Byrd is not taking away work. N'Keal Harry is not taking work. Gunnar Olszewski is not even like a factor, essentially. I think Jacoby Myers should project for one of the higher market shares of both targets and air yards in the entire league. So that more than makes up for playing on a meh offense.
You said it best. Ultimately, this comes down to targets and volume, and Jacoby Myers is set to see them. Conversely, our number 2, Cole Beasley, he maybe isn't set to see quite as much volume with the Buffalo Bills. He's only available in exactly 50% of leagues, so he narrowly meets our threshold. With Cole Beasley, however, perhaps John Brown is out, and if that's the case, he is in line to see more volume and perhaps one of the best offensive schemes in football right now. What do we make of Beasley?
Yeah, Beasley's been a guy who, even when John Brown is healthy-ish, is John Brown ever healthy at this point? He's been sporadically a factor within this offense. And like you said, sure, you're not going to see as much work in terms of overall targets and especially in terms of overall target share and air yard share as someone like Myers. But do you get access to an incredible offense like every single week? I mean, Josh Allen, even when he's slumping, still manages to put up some touchdowns. So I think you get access. And actually, at this point, if John Brown does end up being out, you get decent numbers in terms of the targets and air yards you'd see from Beasley. And those come with the caveat that they are in an awesome offense, unlike Myers. So although less work, sure, I don't think he's a super distant number 2. I think the tier gap really comes after Myers and Beasley. Although this does assume that John Brown misses like a week or two. Beasley is just more if you're like, I hope he gets a touchdown or 50 yards if John Brown is in the lineup.
I think Beasley is like a flex consideration if John Brown is active at this point, just because of how active this Buffalo passing attack has been. And then you have the added upside where if John Brown misses time, Cole Beasley immediately goes into a larger role in the offense. I think for the same reason, you could even look to Gabriel Davis as a flyer. He's not in our top 5 as far as wide receivers go. But Gabriel Davis would be someone I would look to if you're in a pinch and you need somebody just for 1 week if John Brown's injury is short term. Number 3, we start getting to a little more speculative ads, and maybe not so much anymore, but Jalen Rieger comes in as number 3. I call him speculative because he's someone we were guessing would jump into a large role in this offense. He is doing that. It's coming along slowly. The targets are starting to get there for Jalen Rieger. And positively, Alshon Jeffrey returned to this team, and he barely played at all. I think that only adds confidence to Rieger moving forward in the offense. What do you make of him with Philly?
Yeah, he's kind of pushed past this tier of speculative to now really the upside is what is speculative. We have a very solid floor. In the past 4 weeks, it has been 4 targets in his first game, 4 targets in his second game, which I believe was the game he got injured. Then he comes back to 6 and 7 targets. It has been a pretty solid rookie season, although completely truncated by the thumb injury, I believe. But he looks to be actually playing a decent role within this offense. So yeah, it's more of, is the upside speculative? The floor is there as a solid piece within a decent enough passing attack. So I think really what you're talking about with speculative is more, can I get ceiling games from Rieger? And given that he has this field stretching ability, I do think the floor in terms of targets are there, and the ceiling in terms of long splash plays should also be there. So it's more, can he reach the upside of a Myers, or even Cole Beasley upside is such a weird thing to say, but can he reach the upside of a Cole Beasley? And I would say yes, although it is not as likely as a guy like Myers who could just go out and get 12 targets in a game.
I'm with you. I like Jalen Rieger a lot moving forward. This offense is slowly getting healthier on the offensive line. Dallas Goedert's back. Miles Sanders is back. Expecting bigger things from them moving forward. Once we get past Rieger, I do think there's a tier break. Our number 4 is more speculative because we don't know the injury status yet. It's Sammy Watkins, owned in 38% of leagues. You'll know maybe by the time waivers run if he ends up being this high on the waiver list. It's all going to depend on the injury with Watkins. We're targeting him because of his place in an explosive Kansas City offense. And unlike Mecole Hardman, unlike Demarcus Robinson, he's on the field every single play. So I think you can hang your hat on that with Watkins. He should be returning in the next couple weeks. Anything to add with Watkins?
No, I mean, you laid it out. He's on the field every single play with Patrick freaking Mahomes. That's all you need to know, assuming he is healthy, obviously, which we should know at some point here in the next few days. So hopefully we find that out before waivers. But if not, maybe that just means he doesn't get scooped and you can just have him for free. So I would say Watkins is just a piece in the best offense in the league. And that's really all I need to tell me.
Behind him, I do think we get to more speculative ads. But for 5 and 6, I think it's somewhere between Darno, Mooney, and Michael Pittman. And this is a little dichotomy between Darno Mooney, I think, is someone that can give you immediate production. He's seen an increased role in the Chicago offense. I think there is a little bit of capped upside because he's in the Chicago offense. Michael Pittman, he's obviously coming off the injury, just had a big game in their most recent performance. And Michael Pittman does have the upside to run as this team's wide receiver one as he continues to work his way into a larger share. I think if you're looking more towards the playoffs, I would have a preference to Pittman in this situation. If you need a production now, I would look more towards Mooney. But they are just deeper adds, obviously behind Myers, Beasley, Rieger. Any preference for you, Mooney, Pittman, maybe someone else deep on the waiver wire?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Pittman here simply because it's like you said, there is zero chance Darnell Mooney actually ever gets run over Allen Robinson, whereas Michael Pittman in the past 2 weeks has 15 targets. He could potentially be his team's number one receiver. Maybe he doesn't extremely separate himself from a Pascal or from a Hilton, but there is a chance that he does do that, whereas Mooney just has no shot at ever beating out Allen Robinson. Mooney more of maybe a high volume, but just a field stretching like Z receiver, whereas Pittman could be his team's number one alpha receiver. Do I think that's incredibly likely? No, or else we would have put him at number 2 or 3. But I think that is the upside for him. And especially as we get closer to playoffs, I am going to generally trend towards upside, but it does depend what you need. I think you could probably lock in a bit more production by, playing Mooney in the next week or two. But could Pittman, break out in the final few weeks, the fantasy playoffs? Yeah, so I think it depends on your roster construction. I kind of lean towards that Pittman style, but it really depends on what you need.
I agree with you. Pittman's only owned in 10% of leagues too, so you can get him widely. I would definitely take a look at Pittman on your waiver wire. Once we get behind these guys, it is more speculative. I think Alan Lazard, who's available in he's only owned in 42% of leagues. He still could work ahead of MVS. I know MVS has played well the last 2 weeks, so maybe this is more of a timeshare than we know. The Jets have a couple receivers that are finally healthy in Brashad Perriman, Denzel Mims. They're only owned in 8 and 5% of leagues, respectively. There's Jakeem Grant, 5% owned as well, stepping in for an injured Preston Williams. And of course, KJ Hamler, he's 4% owned, but he's back-to-back 10-target games. Anyone else stick out to you just among the deep dart throws?
Yeah, I think Jakeem Grant should be elevated above deep dart throw, but not quite to the level that Pittman and Mooney are. Just our sample on him this season is small, it's one game on him being the number 2 receiver. And our sample on his entire career is that he's basically a special teams player, a tertiary or quaternary receiver. So sure, I think he can step into a decent sized role on an offense that looks good under Tua for the next few weeks, but Preston Williams on IR is projected to come back at some point this season, and his ceiling is still at best the number 2 receiver. So he's kind of just discount Darnell Mooney. I'd only look to him in the deeper leagues, but he is my favorite of the deep shots.
I like it. To recap wide receiver, we have number 1, Jacoby Myers for New England. Number 2 for us is Cole Beasley for Buffalo because he does have a role even when John Brown is healthy. Take John Brown out potentially, and Cole Beasley rises to the wide receiver 2. Number 3 is Rieger, slowly working his way into more opportunity in Philly. Sammy Watkins, tentatively 4 based on his role in Kansas City's offense, given health. That is the biggest thing with Sammy Watkins. And 5 and 6, we have Pittman and Darnell Mooney, respectively. We mentioned some other deep dart throws that we like too. So if you're interested in them, feel free to take a look at your Jakeem Grants. Moving to tight end. Tight end is one of the most barren positions in all of fantasy sports. We didn't really have a lot of injuries, but we were already working with a lot of injuries prior to this week, namely some of your guys like George Kittle. I think the only real injury we saw was to Nick Boyle. But because we've already had a lot of injuries, there's not a lot of available tight ends in the waiver wire that I'm excited about. Just to rattle some names off to you, the top of our list includes Jordan Reed, Logan Thomas, Trey Burton. And then outside of that, we're already looking at some players like Kyle Rudolph and Tyler Eifert. There's just not a lot on the waiver wire this week if you were streaming the tight end position. Do you have a lean between any of those guys at the top?
I have a lean between 2 guys. I would choose out of our top 3. I feel like there's a small tier break at Logan Thomas and Jordan Reed, both of whom I believe saw 6 targets last week. And I was going to say Logan Thomas plays on a dismal offense and his targets come with the caveat that you don't expect him to score nearly as many fantasy points on a per target basis. But Jordan Reed with the now backup quarterbacks, backup linemen, backup receivers, is his offense that much better than Washington? So I really struggle with this. Do you have a strong lean between Reed or Thomas, who both project to be out on a lot of the snaps, especially for Reed, even if they limit his snaps? I think they basically just limit his blocking snaps. He plays as the number 1 receiver. Logan Thomas has seen 4 targets in every single game this season. they both have roles that are good enough to be started every single week moving forward, but their offenses are so bad. Do you have a strong lean between these two guys? Because I'm kind of struggling between our two ugly offenses with good roles and good players, honestly.
I don't have a strong lean. I lean towards Jordan Reed because I think his opportunity could rise based on us just not having a large sample of him this year. Logan Thomas, I think he is what he is at this point, and you're hoping he gets 3 or 4 catches and a touchdown. Jordan Reed maybe could be more. I don't know how likely it is, but that's why I have a slight lean towards him. Any qualms with that?
Yeah, no qualms with that. I'm really struggling between these two guys. And I think also we probably have a stronger prior on Reed being an actually really talented receiver when he's healthy, or at least, receiving tight end when he's healthy, which Logan Thomas is a quarterback convert who at this point, it does seem like he's maybe just so limited by his offense that, 3 catches for 40 yards is just like a godsend from him. Whereas Reed maybe has some longer playmaking upside, but not a strong lean between these two guys. I'll defer to you, though. We'll go Jordan Reed 1 and Logan Thomas 2.
I don't feel good about it. And just to give you guys some reference, Logan Thomas is owned in 35% of leagues. The next most owned tight end is Robert Tonyan, and he's 51% owned. So he doesn't even qualify for our waiver wire show. Like, Logan Thomas is the number 1 tight end who's available in the most leagues. So it is tough. Once we get to our number 3, we're talking Trey Burton, and we're essentially talking a player who's used like Jordan Reed, almost essentially on pass catching routes. But he's splitting time with, when healthy, Jack Doyle and Mo Alley Cox. And we just saw Trey Burton essentially bust lineups in last week. So he's as volatile as they come. But if I had to pick a third one, it's him at this point. Behind him, Dalton Schultz, Chris Herndon are available. We mentioned Tyler Eifert and Kyle Rudolph are available. It's rough, man. Anyone you look to outside of Reed and Logan Thomas.
Yeah, Burton's not a bad play committee tight end. Kyle Rudolph, I guess it depends. Isn't Irv Smith dealing with the concussion? I believe that is the injury.
Yeah,
he's out for
this week.
The game will have already been played by the time that you're watching this show, I assume. If he's out again, I would imagine Kyle Rudolph could take on more of a pass catching role. As of before week 10, he's averaging more blocking snaps than he has routes run. It doesn't end up being awfully surprising on the offense he plays on, but it still is concerning for any real upside. Maybe that changes with the loss of Irv Smith, but in any event, it would still be probably only 1 more week miss from Irv Smith. So I would say maybe he falls into that like Trey Burton level, but it's only a 1 week of Trey Burton production. So I guess I'll call him my number 4. But if you can't get one of Logan Thomas and Jordan Reed, I pray for you. That's the best thing I can do. I can't give you any advice. It's, hey, pick up Trey Burton. Also, Godspeed.
You're not wrong, man. You're not wrong. To recap this barren tight end position, we have Jordan Reed 1, Logan Thomas 2, Trey Burton 3. And I just want to point out before we move on, if you have any of these guys who are available in just over 50% of leagues, like, I definitely would rather take a shot on Robert Tonyan. I would rather take a shot on Tyler Higbee. I would rather take a shot on Jimmy Graham or Mike Gesicki. They're the ones that just narrowly miss our threshold. Any issue for you there?
Yeah, actually, again, maybe we'll see he goes out and gets hurt or goes out and has a crazy game. But Jimmy Graham would be my favorite guy who, if you're watching this, will have already played on Monday night. We don't know what happened. Maybe he scores 2 touchdowns. But he's a guy who is like top 10 or top 5, maybe even red zone targets among tight ends. Gets a decent amount of looks on the most pass-heavy offense in the NFL. Are they the best at passing? Certainly not. But I do think the volume for Jimmy Graham is probably better than all those guys. Although when you look at someone like Tonyan, the efficiency is, of course, going to be better when Aaron Rodgers is your quarterback. I still lean towards the volume, although, like you said, these guys are available in less than half of leagues, so hopefully you can find one of them. But more often than not, you're going to be looking to a Thomas or Reed.
All right, let's talk defense, Kyle. It's a decent streaming week for defenses. And first and foremost, I think there is one very clear option on the waiver wire. Owned in 41% of leagues, it is the Los Angeles Chargers, and they take on the very own New York Jets. Easy call for me. Any qualms with this?
No, you just jam in the opponent of the Jets. And thank God this week they are owned in less than half of leagues. This is I honestly think that you should maybe, if your team is set up well, that you don't need a ton of, firepower to flex, getting in a solid, getting in the best defensive matchup with the Chargers versus the Jets should be a priority on the waiver wire, especially if the defense you currently hold was like a streamer of last week who actually gets a difficult matchup.
For sure. After this, we won't spend much more time on the Chargers. Just play the Chargers against the Jets.
Yes.
Other defenses you could potentially look to. Washington is 31% owned. They take on Cincinnati. We also have Cleveland 18% owned taking on Philadelphia. Given Philadelphia's offensive line struggles and Carson Wentz's league leading interception ratio right now, I would take a look at Cleveland, and they are also available in more leagues. But I can't fault you for going against that banged up Bengals offensive line with a phenomenal Washington pass rush. I would tentatively rank them Cleveland 2, Washington 3, but not a strong lean for me. Any priority for you?
Yeah, I think Carson Wentz's ability to generate turnovers. I know heading into this last week, I believe he was like the only player with over 20 turnover-worthy plays in the NFL. He takes sacks, he throws crazy passes, and I don't think he's a terrible quarterback. He's just he's sort of Jameis Winston-like in that way. And we saw last season, you just want to get decent defenses in against those crazy erratic quarterbacks. So I'm gonna do that against the Eagles this week. Although, like you said, the matchup itself might actually be better in the defensive line versus offensive line mismatch of Washington versus the Bengals. But I think maybe the thing we should be focusing on most is the quarterback play. And, there's not a huge difference between Wentz and Burrow. I just think one of them, Wentz, is going to make more bad mistakes, essentially.
That'll do it for us, guys. Our number 1 and 2 overall for me would be Kalen Balazs and Salvin Ahmed. Try to get them if you can. They're at the most important position. Behind them, taking a look at some receivers, the likes of Cole Beasley, the likes of Jacoby Myers. Any last words, Kyle?
No, I think that's it. I think most teams should be looking at running back because receiver is so deep. So spend your priority waiver bids and free agent bids on running back, even if it's just for a week or two. Then shoot for the moon with, Jacoby Myers.
For sure, guys. Thank you for watching. Of course, this show isn't live, but we have live shows every single day. So make sure to keep your eyes peeled on the YouTube channel. If you don't have a chance to watch those shows live, check out the podcast network. We are available everywhere podcasts can be found. This is the Waiver Wire Show. I am your host, Matt Gajewski, on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. He is Kyle Dvorchak, available on Twitter at Kyle Tweets here. Have a good one, guys. We will see you next week.